Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a time when bread wasn't just a side dish, it was a cornerstone of life. Picture the sun beating down relentlessly over ancient Egypt, the air thick with heat and the scent of spices, herbs, and something a little more earthy. It's a world of bustling markets, towering stone pyramids, and lush, fertile land fed by the mighty Nile River. But don't get too comfortable. If you're about to feast like an Egyptian, you might want to prepare yourself for a grainy surprise. Yes, a literal grain, sometimes sand, sometimes wheat, but always something a little unexpected. After all, this was a civilization where even the food came with its own set of challenges. You probably won't survive this without a few lessons in patience. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. I find it fascinating how food and culture intersect across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the dusty, sun-baked heart of Egypt, bread was life. It wasn't just a meal, it was a vital part of the culture, religion, and economy. The Egyptians relied on bread so much that it was, in a way, their very sustenance. But this was no store-bought loaf. No, the bread of ancient Egypt came in all shapes, sizes, and sometimes an unfortunate texture. You see, flour wasn't quite as refined back then. It was often mixed with sand, and the stones in the mill weren't always as finely ground as we'd like to imagine. A bite of bread could easily come with an unwelcome crunch, reminding you that, yes, you were truly living in ancient times. Historians still argue whether this was an accidental byproduct of the grinding process, or if the sand was added deliberately to add extra roughage. Bread making was an art, and everyone in Egypt had their own favorite version. From simple flatbreads, which were the most common, to heavier, thicker loaves used in religious ceremonies, it was a staple that no one could do without. The methods were relatively simple. Grains of emmer wheat or barley would be ground into flour, then mixed with water and a little yeast to create a dough. This dough was then shaped into discs or loaves and baked in simple clay ovens, or even in the hot coals of a fire. The process was fairly labor-intensive, but for the Egyptians, the smell of freshly baked bread was an everyday comfort in a world that was often unpredictable and harsh. The bread wasn't always just for eating. It had cultural significance too. Loaves of bread were often used as offerings to the gods, left at temples to please deities like Osiris, the god of the underworld, and Ra, the sun god. It wasn't uncommon for bread to be placed on altars, sometimes alongside fruits, meats, and beer, in the hopes of securing favor from the divine. In fact, bread was so vital that it often appeared in tombs as well. When ancient Egyptians were buried with their worldly possessions, loaves of bread were sometimes included as part of the burial ritual, intended to provide the deceased with sustenance in the afterlife. You might wonder how bread could ever make it to the afterlife when it was so vulnerable to the heat and humidity of Egypt's climate. Well, that's where the magic of Egypt's preservation techniques came in. Many tombs were sealed so tightly that the bread and other foods could remain relatively intact for thousands of years. Imagine the thrill of an archaeologist unwrapping an ancient tomb and finding a stale, crusty loaf of bread from the time of the pharaohs. That's one piece of history you could really sink your teeth into, if you're brave enough to try. You're standing in the dusty heart of an ancient Egyptian bakery. The scent of freshly baked bread mixes with the faint smell of wet earth as the Nile floods the land nearby. But there's something else. Something a little odd about the bread here. It's flat. Very flat. Not the fluffy loaf you might be used to today. In fact, this isn't your typical slice of white bread. This is the kind of bread Egyptians relied on, especially the lower classes. It's called aish, and it's the ancient Egyptian staple, a simple, humble bread that fed millions. Its texture? Think of it like a thick, soft, chewy pita, only with a slight crunch around the edges. The wheat for the bread came from the Nile's fertile floodplains, and it was often ground by hand with large stone mills. Bread like this was eaten every day by just about everyone, from the pharaohs to the workers on the massive pyramid projects. But here's the kicker. Bread wasn't always made the way we might expect. Historians still debate whether the bread's texture was due to deliberate choice or accidental imperfection in the milling process. Some believe the Egyptians intentionally made their bread this way to maximize the nutritional value of the flour, while others argue that it was just the best they could do with the grinding technology of the time. Regardless, if you think about it, the bread would have had a substantial, if somewhat gritty appeal. Interestingly, though bread was a common food, the Egyptian elite didn't rely on it alone. Royal meals were far more extravagant, filled with all sorts of lavish food. The bread served to pharaohs was often specially prepared, sometimes including special spices or oils that added flavor and fragrance. And the wealthier classes didn't just eat bread. Oh no, they had plenty of meat, fine vegetables, and fruit at their disposal. So, if you ever wondered whether a king's bread was just like yours, well, it might have been, but it was probably paired with a side of beef or roasted poultry. Bread, in its basic form, was the universal equalizer, feeding both the mighty and the common folk. Despite this, the bread of the masses was often served in simple, humble portions. If you were a common laborer, working long days in the fields or on the construction sites of the pyramids, bread was likely the majority of your diet. But this wasn't some bland carb fest. Bread was sometimes paired with herbs and seasonings that gave it a unique, flavorful twist. Of course, your bread might also come with a side of something unappetizing. A little sand, a few pebbles, or more commonly, a generous helping of dirt that had been ground into the dough. It wasn't ideal, but for the average Egyptian, it was just a part of life. No one was going to question the occasional grain of sand. After all, who had time for that when there was food to be eaten and the gods to appease? Now, if you were living a little higher up on the social ladder, the bread might come with more variety. Some of the richer citizens would mix in seeds, herbs, and perhaps even nuts for a more savory version. They'd also use flour from barley, which was common in Egypt, as well as emmer wheat, which was a little more of a luxury. Ancient Egyptians even invented their own methods for fermenting their dough, giving their bread a slight tanginess that modern bakers would probably envy. No wonder bread was sacred in Egypt. This wasn't just food. It was culture, religion, and sustenance all rolled into one. And then there's the question of beer. You might be wondering, what does beer have to do with bread? Well, in ancient Egypt, beer was practically a food group on its own, and in fact, beer and bread were often made from the same basic ingredients: barley and water. Historians still argue whether the beer Egyptians drank was closer to the porridge-like drink that we imagine or something a little more fermented. Either way, it was an essential part of life. Egyptian beer wasn't filtered or brewed the way modern beer is. Instead, it was thick, cloudy, and had a texture similar to a liquid bread. It was served in clay jars, and you drink it with a straw, sipping the mixture that could range from sweet to sour, depending on the fermentation process. Beer wasn't just a drink. It was a vital part of daily life. In fact, it was such an important staple that laborers working on the massive construction projects of Egypt were often paid in beer. It was both a form of sustenance and a means of social cohesion, something that everyone, from the pharaoh to the common laborer, could share. So, if you were an Egyptian working in the scorching heat of the Nile Valley, you'd probably find yourself sipping a bit of that thick, beer bread concoction to quench your thirst and help you power through the day. You've just taken a sip of ancient Egyptian beer, its thick, cloudy texture coating your tongue as you imagine yourself as a laborer in the blazing heat. The Nile's cool, flowing waters aren't the only thing keeping you alive in this relentless climate. Beer is your constant companion. It's far from the crisp, refreshing drink we're used to today. Instead, it's something closer to a semi-solid porridge-like consistency, almost like drinking a meal. In fact, some ancient Egyptian beer didn't even have hops, meaning its flavor was largely determined by how long it was fermented. The Egyptians didn't have breweries as we know them today, so their methods were much more basic. Barley was soaked, ground, and then allowed to ferment naturally. What you ended up with was a beverage that was nutritional, caloric, and sometimes a little too strong for comfort. Beer wasn't just for the common folk, though. While most Egyptians drank it throughout the day, the elite had a different way of enjoying it. For them, beer was a luxury. Wealthier Egyptians might mix their beer with various fruits and herbs, making it more flavorful and refined. But for the laborers, those who built the massive monuments to the gods, beer was an essential part of their diet, keeping them hydrated and full, especially after a long day under the scorching sun. Historians still argue whether this beer was primarily consumed as a form of sustenance or more as a social lubricant, something to bring the workers together as they toiled away at construction sites or in the fields. Either way, it's clear that beer was deeply ingrained in Egyptian culture. And it wasn't only about getting drunk. It was about survival and ritual. But of course, when it came to what was consumed in ancient Egypt, beer wasn't the only drink on the table. Along with the barley concoction, the Egyptians enjoyed a wide variety of beverages that were integral to their daily lives. Wine, though far less common than beer, was also produced in Egypt. It was a symbol of wealth and luxury, consumed primarily by the elite. Wine was often mixed with spices or honey to create a sweeter, more refined drink. For those who could afford it, wine was the drink of the gods, and it was offered during religious ceremonies to honor the deities. Despite the allure of wine, beer was the go-to drink for the majority of Egyptians, with the fermentation process forming a significant part of Egyptian food culture. You could almost call it the nation's national drink, vital to both daily life and religious observance. In fact, beer wasn't just consumed by humans, it was often offered to the gods as part of rituals. The Egyptians believed that gods, particularly those of the afterlife, could also benefit from a good hearty drink. It's said that the god Osiris, associated with the afterlife and agriculture, was often depicted with a bowl of beer in his hands. There's even evidence that the pharaoh himself was expected to participate in these divine beer offerings, ensuring that both the gods and his people had their fill of the sacred beverage. But no drink could stand alone in ancient Egypt, and that's where the food came in. It wasn't just bread and beer that made up the Egyptian diet. The fruits and vegetables of the land played an equally important role in shaping what would be served on the tables of the common folk and the elites alike. A walk through an Egyptian market would reveal an abundance of vegetables and fruits, with some of the most common being onions, garlic, and leeks. These vegetables weren't just a part of the diet because they were easily grown. They had symbolic meanings as well. Onions, for example, were believed to possess powerful protective qualities. The ancient Egyptians thought of them as a symbol of eternal life, thanks to their concentric layers. Garlic, on the other hand, was believed to offer strength, and it was often used by workers as a form of sustenance to help them endure long days of labor. Garlic's pungent odor also had a more practical use, keeping bugs and pests at bay. In a country where insects could carry disease, garlic was a natural defense, making it as important as any medicinal herb. Historians still debate whether the Egyptian reverence for garlic and onions was purely functional, or if there was a deeper spiritual connection to these foods. Garlic, in particular, had a unique status in Egypt. It was sometimes used as an offering to the gods, with its strong, spicy scent believed to ward off evil spirits. The consumption of garlic was even linked to the power of the gods themselves. For instance, the god Thoth, associated with wisdom and writing, was said to have had a special connection with garlic. Its use in daily meals was a sign that the people weren't just eating to survive, they were eating to connect with the divine. As you continue on your culinary journey through ancient Egypt, it's hard not to notice how intertwined food was with the culture and religion of the time. Food wasn't just fuel. It was a link between the earthly and the divine. Whether it was the beer that made its way into the temples or the bread that was placed in tombs, every aspect of Egyptian food had its own sacred significance. But life wasn't all about surviving on basic rations or appeasing the gods with offerings. Egypt had a wealth of other foods to indulge in, especially when the seasons changed. As the Nile flooded and the land became rich with crops, fruits like dates and figs became central to the Egyptian diet. These sweet treats were not only enjoyed as snacks, but were also used in religious ceremonies. Figs, in particular, were associated with fertility and were often offered to gods in hopes of receiving blessings for abundant harvests. Imagine walking along the banks of the Nile, the golden light of the setting sun shimmering on the water. The air is filled with the earthy scent of ripe dates and figs as merchants set up their stalls. These fruits weren't just a luxury in ancient Egypt. They were a part of the everyday diet. Dates, with their sweet and rich flavor, were eaten by almost everyone, from common folk to pharaohs. They were prized for their high nutritional value, providing energy and sustenance, making them ideal for people working in the fields under the harsh sun. In fact, historians still argue whether dates were considered a daily necessity or more of a festive treat, considering their nutritional benefits and cultural significance. What's clear is that they were an important part of Egyptian life, sometimes even appearing in tombs as offerings to the gods. Figs, on the other hand, were particularly symbolic in Egyptian culture. They were associated with fertility and abundance, which made them especially important in agricultural ceremonies. The goddess Hathor, who represented love, beauty, and fertility, was often linked to figs. It was believed that she would bestow blessings upon the harvest when these fruits were offered to her. In a way, eating figs wasn't just a physical act. It was a connection to the divine, a way of honoring the gods and ensuring that the land would continue to thrive. Figs were also used in Egyptian medicine, believed to have healing properties that could aid in digestion and help with other health issues. As much as dates and figs were beloved, they weren't the only fruits in the Egyptian diet. The fertile lands surrounding the Nile provided a bounty of fruits, including pomegranates, melons, and grapes. Pomegranates were especially prized for their juice, which was sometimes fermented to create a sweet wine-like drink. The ancient Egyptians didn't drink wine the way we do today, but their sweet fruit-based beverages were a precursor to modern juices and wines, making them a subtle yet important part of Egyptian culinary history. Grapes, often associated with luxury, were another staple in the Egyptian diet. While wine was considered a drink for the upper classes, fresh grapes were widely consumed by both elites and common folk alike. These juicy, succulent fruits were eaten fresh, dried into raisins, or used to make syrups and sauces. Grapes were so prized that they were sometimes depicted in tombs and temples, further illustrating their cultural significance. They weren't just an edible treat, they symbolized abundance, vitality, and the generosity of the gods. Though fruits like dates, figs, and grapes were certainly common in Egypt, the vegetables and herbs grown in the rich soil along the Nile were just as vital. The Nile's annual flooding made the surrounding land perfect for farming, and the Egyptians took full advantage of this fertile soil. Along with onions and garlic, which we've already discussed, the Egyptians grew a variety of vegetables, including lettuce, cucumbers, and radishes. These veggies were commonly served with bread and beer, adding some much-needed variety to the basic staples. Lettuce, which we often think of as a leafy green for salads, had a much different role in ancient Egypt. It wasn't just a side dish or garnish, it had symbolic meaning. Lettuce was associated with the god Min, the deity of fertility, and was often included in offerings to him. The Egyptians believed that lettuce had aphrodisiacal properties, and it was sometimes eaten before rituals to help promote fertility and virility. Imagine sitting down for a meal, taking a bite of lettuce, and knowing that you were connecting with the divine forces of creation. It's a fascinating glimpse into how food and spirituality were intertwined in ancient Egyptian culture. Cucumbers were another vegetable that found its way onto Egyptian tables. Known for their cooling properties, cucumbers were particularly important during the scorching summer months. They were often served as a refreshing side dish to balance out the heat, helping to keep the body hydrated. Cucumbers weren't just eaten raw, they could be pickled, allowing them to be stored for longer periods. This made them a valuable food item during times when fresh vegetables weren't as readily available, especially during the off-season for farming. Radishes, too, were an important vegetable in ancient Egypt. They were easy to grow in the fertile Nile soil and were often eaten as a snack or served alongside bread and beer. But radishes weren't just about flavor. They were also believed to have medicinal properties. They were thought to help with digestion and were used as a remedy for various ailments. Like garlic and onions, radishes were sometimes offered to the gods in hopes of receiving their blessings. They were a symbol of health and vitality, further emphasizing how food was intertwined with both physical well-being and spiritual belief. Historians still debate the exact ways these vegetables were prepared and served. Were they roasted, boiled, or simply eaten raw? Were they cooked in elaborate stews, or was the food kept simple and straightforward? Given the resources available to the Egyptians, it's likely that their meals were a mix of both. The everyday food of the common people was simpler, while the elite enjoyed more elaborate dishes made from these same basic ingredients. Beyond these common vegetables, the Egyptians also had access to legumes and beans, which played an important role in their diet. Beans, lentils, and peas were easy to grow and packed with protein, making them an important addition to meals. They were often prepared in soups, stews, or bread. In fact, beans were sometimes ground into flour to create a kind of dough, which could be shaped into cakes and fried. This versatility made them a valuable food source for both the common folk and the elites, though the way they were prepared likely varied depending on one's social status. As you continue your journey through ancient Egypt's foodscape, it's impossible not to notice the abundance of bread. Bread wasn't just food in Egypt. It was the cornerstone of the diet. This humble loaf was more than a meal. It was an essential part of daily life, so much so that the Egyptians often referred to it as the staff of life. Egyptians ate bread with virtually every meal, from breakfast to dinner, and it came in all sorts of shapes, sizes, and textures. But just as with beer, there was a clear distinction between the bread consumed by the common folk and that enjoyed by the elite. Most bread in ancient Egypt was made from emmer wheat, a hardy grain that grew well in the Nile's fertile soil. However, barley, another grain found in abundance, was also used in bread making. Emmer wheat bread was typically more refined and better in taste, while barley bread was coarser, rougher, and often served to the lower classes. The bread was usually baked in an oven, often an open-air brick structure heated by burning wood. Some bread loaves were round, while others were flat and crisp, often used to scoop up food or dip in sauces. Interestingly, historians still argue whether bread's significance in Egypt extended beyond nourishment and into the realm of ritual. It's believed that bread was often used in religious ceremonies and placed in tombs as an offering to ensure the deceased's well-being in the afterlife. At the heart of every meal, bread served a practical purpose. It provided essential carbohydrates to sustain the hard-working population. The poor often ate their bread with simple sides, such as vegetables, beans, and a bit of fruit, as we've discussed. The bread could also be dipped in the semi-thick beer or covered in a small amount of olive oil, both staples of Egyptian cuisine. For the wealthy, however, bread could be made more luxurious. While basic loaves were a regular feature, the elite had access to fancier breads, sometimes sweetened with honey or enriched with various herbs and spices to enhance the flavor. They might even have bread baked with fruit, which likely made it a special treat at banquets and feasts. Beyond bread and beer, the Egyptians consumed a wide variety of other foods, including dairy products. Despite Egypt's hot, dry climate, dairy was still an important part of the diet. though it was mostly reserved for the wealthier classes. Milk, butter, and cheese were produced in relatively small quantities, and their consumption was often tied to religious rituals. For instance, the goddess Hathor, who was associated with love, fertility, and music, was sometimes depicted with a cow, symbolizing the importance of dairy in Egyptian life. Historians debate whether dairy products were a staple in the diet or more of a luxury for the elite. Milk was often given as an offering to the gods, as were butter and cheese. In addition to dairy, the Egyptians also raised a variety of animals for meat. While red meat, like beef and lamb, was less common, poultry such as ducks, geese, and chickens was frequently consumed. The Egyptians were skilled at raising fowl, and ducks and geese were commonly raised for their meat and eggs. Ducks were especially favored for their rich flavor, while geese were often depicted in Egyptian art, perhaps as a symbol of wealth. The consumption of poultry was also tied to specific festivals and rituals, where it was often sacrificed to the gods. Though meat was enjoyed, it wasn't eaten every day by most Egyptians. Instead, fish from the Nile played a vital role in the diet. The river was teeming with fish, providing a constant source of protein. Fish such as tilapia, perch, and catfish were common catches, and the Egyptians developed various techniques for preserving them, including drying and salting. Dried fish was often used in stews, while salted fish was sometimes eaten on its own or added to bread. The preservation of fish meant that it could be eaten even during times of drought or low fish abundance, ensuring a steady food supply year-round. Historians are still uncertain whether fish was a luxury for the elite or a common food for the masses. Some believe that fish was more likely consumed by common folk, while the wealthy would have preferred the richer meats like poultry and lamb. The idea that fish was more accessible to the lower classes is supported by the evidence of fishing practices, with many common people relying on fishing for both food and trade. No meal in ancient Egypt would be complete without something sweet, and the Egyptians certainly had a sweet tooth. Honey, which was prized for its natural sweetness and medicinal properties, was used extensively in both cooking and religious rituals. It was often added to desserts or mixed into drinks. The Egyptians also made use of dates in desserts, sometimes grinding them into pastes and mixing them with nuts or fruit. This sweet concoction could be formed into balls or cakes and served at feasts and special occasions. In addition to these treats, the ancient Egyptians made a sort of syrup from figs, which was often used to sweeten other foods, especially in the elite households. Historians still argue whether these sweet treats were a true indulgence of the wealthy or if they were commonly available to the broader population. The fact that honey was used in religious rituals, however, suggests that it had a symbolic significance beyond just being a treat for the taste buds. Honey was often offered to the gods, as it was believed to have healing and protective properties. Offering honey to the deities was a way to invoke blessings for prosperity, health, and good harvests. It's evident that food in ancient Egypt wasn't just a way to stay alive. It was a deeply cultural and religious experience. Food was an offering to the gods, a symbol of abundance, and a key part of social and spiritual life. The Egyptians understood the importance of sustenance, not just for the body, but also for the soul. Meals were moments of connection to the land, to the gods, and to each other. As the evening cools and you imagine yourself in ancient Egypt, it's easy to picture the bustling markets near the Nile. The aroma of freshly baked bread mingles with the earthy scent of herbs and spices, creating a symphony of smells that makes your mouth water. Among the key spices in Egyptian cuisine was garlic, which was used not just for its flavor, but for its supposed medicinal properties. Garlic was considered a cure-all, often consumed raw, mashed, or mixed into dishes like stews and bread. Its strong, pungent taste made it a favorite for adding bold flavor to otherwise simple meals. Garlic's place in Egyptian society extended beyond the kitchen. There are records of it being used in ancient Egyptian medicine, where it was believed to protect against ailments and even ward off evil spirits. Historians still debate the extent to which garlic was used medicinally compared to its role in cooking. Some believe it was essential for health and healing, while others suggest it was more of a symbolic item linked to the protection of the body from disease or even dark forces. In ancient tombs, garlic bulbs were sometimes found as offerings to the gods, perhaps to ensure the protection of the deceased in the afterlife. Whether it was a physical remedy or a spiritual safeguard, garlic was undoubtedly important in the ancient Egyptian food system. Alongside garlic, onions were another common ingredient in Egyptian meals. Like garlic, onions had both culinary and medicinal value. The Egyptians cultivated a variety of onions, some sweet, others more pungent, and they were often used as a flavor base for dishes like stews and soups. Onions were also packed with nutrients, including antioxidants and vitamins, which may explain why they were considered a vital food for keeping the body strong and healthy. Interestingly, onions had a symbolic role as well, often associated with eternal life. The shape of an onion, with its layers, was believed to represent the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, making it a fitting food for the afterlife. This connection between onions and the afterlife was so strong that they were sometimes included in burial offerings, ensuring that the deceased would be nourished in the next life. Historians are still unsure whether onions were as common as garlic in the everyday Egyptian diet, or whether they were considered a more ceremonial food, used mostly in offerings or for specific religious purposes. Regardless, their importance in ancient Egyptian food culture cannot be denied. Moving on to another integral part of ancient Egyptian meals, let's consider the role of legumes. Beans, lentils, and peas were a key protein source, especially for the lower classes who had limited access to meat. These legumes were often used in soups, stews, and bread, providing both sustenance and nutrition. Legumes were also highly valued for their ability to grow in the nutrient-rich Nile soil. The Egyptians were skilled at planting and harvesting beans, making them a reliable food source throughout the year. Historians still debate whether legumes were as popular in the diets of the elite as they were in the diets of the lower classes. It's possible that beans and lentils were seen as a humble food for the working population, while meat and fish were reserved for the more privileged. Yet, legumes were such a staple in the Egyptian diet that they couldn't be overlooked, even in discussions of elite feasts. While the wealthy might have enjoyed their meat, fish, and sweeter foods, legumes remained a mainstay on most tables. Interestingly, in some tombs, legumes have been found as offerings, suggesting they were also seen as a symbolic food. The inclusion of beans in these tombs might indicate that they were thought to provide nourishment and sustenance for the deceased in the afterlife. Like bread and beer, legumes had a cultural significance that extended beyond just being a foodstuff. They were part of the Egyptians' broader worldview, one in which every meal was an offering, every bite a connection to the divine. When it comes to the more luxurious foods available to the Egyptian elite, fruits like pomegranates, melons, and grapes were highly valued. Pomegranates, often seen as a symbol of fertility and abundance, were used in both cooking and religious ceremonies. Their sweet, tangy juice was often enjoyed by the wealthy, who could afford the labor-intensive process of extracting the juice. Pomegranate seeds were sometimes mixed with honey to create a sweet treat that would have delighted the upper classes. Pomegranates were also believed to have medicinal properties, which made them especially desirable in both the kitchen and the temple. Melons, particularly watermelon, were another beloved fruit. The Egyptians were likely among the first to cultivate watermelon, and it became a popular snack, particularly during the hot summer months. Historians still argue whether watermelon was seen more as a luxury food for the elite or a refreshing treat enjoyed by the broader population. Given its cooling properties, watermelon would have been particularly appealing in the scorching desert heat of Egypt. The fruit's water content made it an excellent way to stay hydrated, and it was likely eaten fresh or preserved through drying for later consumption. Grapes, meanwhile, were not only eaten fresh, but also used in winemaking. Wine was considered a luxury item, enjoyed mostly by the elite, but the production of wine was an important industry in ancient Egypt. Grapes were grown in vineyards, and the juice was fermented to produce a variety of wines. While wine was consumed during feasts and religious rituals, it wasn't as ubiquitous as beer. Beer was the more common alcoholic beverage, consumed daily by the majority of Egyptians, while wine was reserved for special occasions. Historians still debate the extent to which wine was consumed by the lower classes, as the evidence is somewhat conflicting. Some suggest that wine was a status symbol, an indulgence reserved for the rich and powerful, while others argue that the presence of vineyards and the production of wine in large quantities meant that it is accessible to a wider population than we might think. Whatever the case, wine and grapes played an undeniable role in ancient Egyptian culture, both as a foodstuff and as a symbol of wealth and abundance. As you continue down the winding path of ancient Egyptian cuisine, it's important to note that the Egyptians weren't just concerned with what they ate, but how they prepared it. Food preparation in ancient Egypt was an art in itself, and it required a great deal of skill, especially for the elite. The art of cooking was something that the wealthy took great pride in, and they often employed specialized servants and cooks to prepare their elaborate meals. These cooks were highly skilled in their craft, often trained in the art of food presentation and flavor balancing. One of the most significant cooking methods used by the ancient Egyptians was roasting, particularly when it came to meats. Roasting allowed the flavors of the meat to develop fully and gave it a rich, smoky taste that would have been irresistible. The wealthy Egyptians would often roast lamb, poultry, and even wild game over an open flame or in clay ovens, with spices like coriander and cumin being used to enhance the flavors. For the lower classes, however, the method of cooking was simpler. Stews and soups were common, and meat was often boiled or slow-cooked in a pot over a fire. These dishes were often thickened with ingredients like beans, lentils, or vegetables, making them hearty and filling. Historians still argue over whether cooking was more of an art form in the kitchens of the wealthy, with intricate dishes prepared for banquets, or whether these methods were more widely spread among the common folk. Some scholars believe that elaborate meals were reserved for the elite, while others suggest that many of these cooking techniques, such as roasting, might have been common in everyday life. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, as the common people certainly had access to some form of roasting, but it was likely less refined and extravagant than the methods used for the upper class. Another cooking method that was significant in ancient Egypt was baking, especially in the context of bread. As mentioned before, bread was a staple in the diet, and baking it was an essential skill. Egyptians used both wood-fired and mud brick ovens to bake bread, creating everything from simple flatbreads to more complex loaves. The baking process itself was a delicate art, with the bread needing to be perfectly kneaded and shaped before being placed in the oven. Many of the bakeries that existed in ancient Egypt were communal, and large quantities of bread were produced daily to feed the population. These bakeries were an essential part of Egyptian society, with the bread being distributed to both the rich and the poor. Baking wasn't limited to bread alone, though. The ancient Egyptians also baked cakes and pastries, often using honey or fruit to sweeten the batter. These treats were usually reserved for special occasions or feasts, as the ingredients were often expensive and labor-intensive to obtain. One particularly popular type of cake was made with dates and nuts, providing a natural sweetness and a crunchy texture. These cakes were sometimes served with wine or beer, making them a perfect accompaniment to any festive meal. As you can imagine, the process of preparing and cooking food in ancient Egypt was highly communal. In both urban centers and rural villages, people gathered together to prepare meals, whether it was kneading dough for bread, roasting meats over an open flame, or preparing stews and soups in large clay pots. These communal cooking practices created a strong sense of community, and food was often shared among family members, friends, and neighbors. It's clear that food preparation wasn't just about nourishment. It was about connecting with others, sharing experiences, and celebrating life together. Historians still debate the social implications of communal cooking and dining in ancient Egypt. Some argue that it strengthened bonds within families and communities, fostering a sense of solidarity. Others suggest that food was a way of reinforcing social hierarchies, with the elite enjoying more elaborate meals and the lower classes having more modest fare. Regardless of the social dynamics, it's evident that food and cooking were central to Egyptian society, and the act of preparing a meal was just as important as the meal itself. Beyond the kitchen, ancient Egyptian food culture was deeply tied to religion. Food offerings to the gods were a key part of Egyptian worship, and certain foods had symbolic significance. Bread, beer, fruits, and meats were often offered to the gods as a way of ensuring their favor and blessings. These offerings were made at temples, altars, and tombs, and they were believed to sustain the gods in the afterlife, just as food sustained the living on earth. The belief that food was not only for nourishment, but also for spiritual purposes underscores the profound connection the ancient Egyptians had with their food and the divine. Take the case of the goddess Hathor. who was often associated with food, drink, and fertility. As one of the most beloved deities in the Egyptian pantheon, Hathor was seen as the provider of abundance and nourishment. She was frequently depicted as a cow or a woman with the head of a cow, symbolizing her connection to milk and dairy products. It was common for Egyptians to make offerings of milk, butter, and cheese to Hathor in hopes of receiving her blessings of fertility, both in terms of agriculture and human life. In fact, Hathor's association with food was so strong that many ancient Egyptians believed she played a role in ensuring a bountiful harvest and abundant supplies of food. Historians still debate the extent to which food offerings to Hathor and other gods were part of the daily lives of Egyptians, or whether they were reserved for special religious occasions. Some believe that food offerings were made regularly as part of everyday worship, while others suggest that they were more ceremonial, tied to specific festivals or important life events. Regardless, food played a central role in Egyptian religious practice, and the act of offering food to the gods was seen as a way to honor the divine and secure blessings for the future. Imagine the warm, sun-drenched days of ancient Egypt, where the sound of bustling markets and the chatter of villagers fill the air. You can almost feel the dust beneath your feet as you walk past vendors selling their goods. One such vendor might have offered honey, one of the most prized ingredients in ancient Egyptian cuisine. Honey wasn't just a sweetener, though. It was regarded as a symbol of wealth and prosperity. Its golden color and rich flavor made it a luxury item, especially for the elite. The Egyptians used honey in a variety of ways, sweetening cakes and pastries, mixing it with fruit, and even using it as a base for some sauces. Honey was also believed to have medicinal properties, with ancient texts mentioning it as a treatment for wounds, digestive issues, and coughs. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of honey in ancient Egypt was its connection to the gods. Bees, and by extension honey, were thought to have a divine connection. In Egyptian mythology, the sun god Ra was said to have created bees from his tears, and the sweetness of honey was seen as a gift from the heavens. Honey was often used in religious offerings, especially to deities like Ra and Osiris. The belief that bees were sacred meant that honey, as their product, had a special spiritual significance. It wasn't just about using honey in the kitchen. It was about invoking divine favor. Historians still debate whether honey was a commodity that could be enjoyed by everyone or whether it was reserved for the elite. Some suggest that it was an expensive, rare product only accessible to the wealthy, while others point to evidence that honey was used more widely across Egyptian society. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, with honey being a treat for both the upper classes and those who had access to it. But it was certainly something that could elevate a dish from simple to extraordinary. While honey might have been a luxury, another essential food item, dates, was far more widely available in ancient Egypt. Dates were one of the most important fruits in Egyptian diets and were grown in abundance along the banks of the Nile. They were rich in natural sugars, which provided a quick source of energy. Dates were commonly eaten fresh or dried, and they were also used in a variety of recipes. One of the most popular ways to enjoy dates was by stuffing them with nuts or mixing them with honey to create a sweet treat. For the Egyptians, dates weren't just a snack. They were a versatile ingredient that could be added to both savory and sweet dishes, as well as beverages. Interestingly, dates also had cultural and religious significance. They were often associated with the goddess Hathor, who, as mentioned earlier, was linked to food, drink, and fertility. Hathor's followers would offer dates in rituals, seeking her blessings for fertility and abundance. Dates were often placed in tombs as offerings to the deceased, ensuring that the dead would have a steady supply of nourishment in the afterlife. This connection between dates and the afterlife shows how deeply food was woven into the spiritual fabric of Egyptian life. It wasn't just about sustaining the body, it was about maintaining connections with the divine, both in life and death. As you stroll through the marketplace in your mind, you might also encounter vendors selling the essential Egyptian drink, beer. Beer was an integral part of ancient Egyptian life, consumed by people of all social classes. The Egyptians brewed beer from barley, which was fermented to create a thick, porridge-like drink that was low in alcohol. Beer was a daily staple for many, consumed with nearly every meal. It was especially popular among the working classes, who relied on it for sustenance. Beer was nutritious, providing vitamins and minerals, and was often served with bread, creating a balanced meal that kept people energized throughout the day. Historians still argue about the exact nature of ancient Egyptian beer. Some believe it was more of a food than a beverage, as it was so thick and filling. Others suggest that it was more akin to the beer we know today, though with a much lower alcohol content. The ancient Egyptians also flavored their beer with a variety of ingredients, including dates, honey, and spices, giving it a unique and complex taste. While beer was common among the lower classes, it was also consumed by the elite, albeit in more refined forms. Pharaohs and nobles might have had access to special brews, prepared by skilled brewers using the finest ingredients. What's fascinating is that beer wasn't just for drinking. It had a variety of uses in ancient Egyptian culture. It was often used in religious ceremonies and offerings to the gods. In fact, the goddess Hathor, who was associated with fertility and abundance, was also linked to beer. The ancient Egyptians believed that she was the creator of beer, and she was often depicted holding a vessel of the drink. Beer was so important in religious rituals that priests would brew large quantities for use in temple ceremonies. Beer was also used as an offering to the deceased, ensuring that those in the afterlife would continue to enjoy the drink in the afterlife, much like the living. In addition to its ceremonial and religious significance, beer also played a role in social bonding. It was often consumed in large gatherings, where people would sit together, share food and drink, and engage in conversation. These gatherings were an essential part of Egyptian life, strengthening relationships and fostering a sense of community. Historians still debate the social implications of beer consumption. Some believe that it was a unifying force, bringing together people of all social classes, while others argue that it was a way of reinforcing social hierarchies. Regardless, beer remained a constant presence in Egyptian life, its role far-reaching and its importance undeniable. As we continue our journey through the culinary traditions of ancient Egypt, let's delve deeper into some of the more exotic ingredients that flavored their meals. Picture yourself walking through the bustling streets of Thebes or Memphis, and the air is thick with the scent of spices. Spices weren't just used for taste, they were tied to the spiritual, medicinal, and economic spheres of Egyptian society. One spice that was highly valued in ancient Egypt was coriander. Coriander was used in cooking for its unique flavor, but it also had medicinal properties. The Egyptians used coriander to treat a variety of ailments, including digestive issues, and it was often included in recipes for stews and breads. Historians still debate the origins of coriander in Egypt. Some believe it was native to the region, while others suggest it was introduced from neighboring regions like the Levant. Regardless of its origins, coriander became a staple in Egyptian cuisine, and it was commonly used in both sweet and savory dishes. Egyptians also used coriander in beer brewing, and it's thought that its inclusion in the brewing process could help enhance the flavor of the beer, adding a delicate yet complex note to the drink. Another popular spice in ancient Egypt was cumin. Cumin was a key ingredient in Egyptian cooking, used to flavor meats, soups, and sauces. Like coriander, cumin was also thought to have medicinal properties, and it was used in treatments for digestive problems and as a remedy for bad breath. Cumin's earthy, warm flavor made it a perfect match for the rich stews and roasts that were popular among the ancient Egyptians. Historians still argue over the true role of cumin in ancient Egyptian society, whether it was primarily a culinary spice or if its medicinal uses took precedence. Given its widespread use, it's likely that cumin played a significant role in both domains. While spices like coriander and cumin were integral to Egyptian cooking, there was one ingredient that was considered to be the true foundation of the Egyptian diet: grain. The staple grain of ancient Egypt was emmer wheat, a type of wheat that was used to make bread, porridge, and beer. The ancient Egyptians were masters at growing grain, particularly along the fertile banks of the Nile River, where the annual flooding of the river left rich, nutrient-dense soil ideal for farming. The grain was ground into flour and used in a variety of ways, but perhaps the most iconic use of grain was in the production of bread. Bread was so important in Egyptian society that it was often used as a form of currency. Workers, especially those who labored on large building projects like the pyramids, were paid in bread and beer. Bread itself came in many forms: flatbreads, loaves, and even sweetbreads, each with its own texture and flavor. Some breads were served plain, while others were flavored with spices like coriander and cumin, or enriched with ingredients like dates and honey. These sweet breads were often served as part of the banquets for the wealthy, where the bread was a symbol of abundance and prosperity. Historians still debate the significance of bread in ancient Egyptian culture. Some suggest that bread was so deeply embedded in the daily life of the Egyptians that it had a spiritual significance, representing life itself. Bread was often included as an offering in religious ceremonies, placed on altars or in tombs to nourish the gods and the deceased in the afterlife. Other scholars argue that bread was primarily a practical food, a necessity for survival, and that its ritualistic role was secondary. Regardless of its spiritual or practical importance, it's clear that bread was essential to the diet of every Egyptian, from the poorest laborer to the wealthiest noble. In addition to emmer wheat, another grain that was important to the ancient Egyptians was barley. Barley was used to make beer, but it was also used in baking. Barley bread was often coarser and denser than bread made from wheat, but it was still a staple food for many. Barley was grown alongside wheat, and it thrived in the same fertile soil along the Nile River. While wheat bread was more common among the elite, barley bread was more common among the lower classes. It's interesting to note that barley beer, which was thicker and less alcoholic than modern beer, was also a key part of the diet for many ancient Egyptians. The beverage was considered nutritious, providing sustenance to workers and farmers who needed energy throughout the day. The importance of barley in Egyptian society extended beyond just food. Barley was often used as an offering to the gods, particularly the god Osiris, who was associated with agriculture and fertility. Barley was also a key component in the embalming process, where it was used to wrap the deceased, symbolizing the renewal of life and resurrection in the afterlife. The use of barley in religious rituals speaks to the deep connection between food, agriculture, and spirituality in ancient Egypt. As we shift our focus from grains to fruits, it's worth noting that the ancient Egyptians had a wide variety of fruits available to them, especially those grown along the Nile. The fertile land and abundant water supply made it an ideal environment for cultivating fruits like figs, pomegranates, and melons. These fruits were often eaten fresh, but they were also dried for storage, allowing them to be enjoyed during the hotter months when fresh fruit was scarce. Figs in particular were highly prized, often eaten as a sweet snack or used in desserts. They were also used in religious offerings, symbolizing prosperity and fertility. Historians still debate the extent to which fruits like figs and pomegranates were available to the general population versus the elite. Now, let's explore the world of ancient Egyptian dairy products. While today we think of milk, cheese, and butter as basic pantry staples, these dairy products weren't as common in ancient Egypt as they are now. The Egyptians did have access to milk, particularly from cows and goats, but milk wasn't consumed as freely as it is today. Instead, it was often used to make cheese and yogurt, which were more stable and easier to store. Cheese, in particular, was an important part of the diet, and the Egyptians developed a variety of cheeses, ranging from soft, fresh cheeses to firmer, more aged varieties. Historians still debate the significance of dairy products in ancient Egypt. Some scholars believe that milk, especially cow's milk, was not as highly regarded as it might be in other ancient cultures, partly due to Egypt's warm climate, which made milk spoil more quickly. Others argue that dairy was considered a luxury, consumed mostly by the elite or used in religious offerings. Despite these debates, it's clear that dairy played a role in Egyptian society, particularly in the form of cheese. The ancient Egyptians were skilled in preserving dairy products, and cheese was often made from goat's milk, which was easier to manage in the desert environment. Cheese was a key part of the diet for both the wealthy and the working classes, providing a valuable source of protein and fat. In addition to dairy, another staple in the Egyptian diet was legumes. Beans, lentils, and chickpeas were widely consumed and were a crucial part of the diet, particularly for the lower classes. These legumes were rich in protein, providing an essential source of nourishment for workers and farmers. They were often cooked in stews or soups, sometimes combined with grains like barley or wheat to create a more substantial meal. Legumes were also used in bread making, providing an additional layer of nutrition and flavor to the bread. Historians still argue whether legumes were a luxury food or a necessity. Some suggest that beans and lentils were used primarily by the working classes, while others point to evidence that these legumes were enjoyed by people of all social statuses. The fact that legumes were a versatile, affordable food item suggests they were a common and necessary part of the diet. However, they may have been more prominent in the meals of the lower classes, especially in regions where grains like wheat were less available. One particularly interesting aspect of legumes in ancient Egypt is their role in religious rituals. Certain legumes were used as offerings to the gods, particularly the fertility gods. Beans, lentils, and chickpeas were associated with abundance and growth, and they were often included in offerings to ensure the prosperity of crops. The symbolism of legumes as a representation of life and renewal ties them to the broader Egyptian belief in the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. As we consider the diet of the ancient Egyptians, it's important to remember that food wasn't just for sustenance. Every meal, every ingredient carried meaning. Meals were often prepared and consumed with a sense of reverence, particularly among the elite. Food was a way to honor the gods, ensure the favor of the divine, and secure the prosperity of the land. For the elite, feasting was a symbol of their status, and large banquets were occasions for displaying wealth, social power, and religious devotion. These feasts were often extravagant affairs with multiple courses, complex dishes, and lavish drinks. Meat, such as beef, lamb, and poultry, was typically reserved for these banquets and was a symbol of abundance. Meat was also consumed during religious festivals, where it was offered to the gods as part of the rituals. Historians still debate how frequently meat was consumed in ancient Egypt. Some suggest that meat was a rare and expensive food item, only eaten during special occasions, while others point to evidence that meat was a regular part of the diet for the upper classes. The cost and rarity of meat meant that it was often reserved for the wealthy, with the lower classes having limited access to animal products. The ancient Egyptians raised livestock for meat, but also for other products like milk, wool, and leather. Animals like cattle, sheep, goats, and poultry were kept in large herds or flocks, and they were an important part of the agricultural economy. Another significant part of the Egyptian diet was fish. The Nile River, with its rich biodiversity, provided a plentiful source of fish. Fish was widely consumed across all social classes, particularly in regions closer to the river. The Egyptians were skilled fishermen, using a variety of techniques like nets, hooks, and traps to catch fish. Fish was often eaten fresh, but it could also be dried or salted for preservation. Fish like tilapia, catfish, and perch were common in the Egyptian diet, and they were usually prepared by grilling, baking, or frying. Fish was also used in religious rituals, where it was offered to the gods as a symbol of abundance and fertility. Historians still debate the role of fish in ancient Egyptian society. Some suggest that fish was considered a food for the lower classes, particularly those living near the Nile, while others argue that fish was a highly prized delicacy enjoyed by the elite. The fact that fish was consumed across all classes suggests that it was an important and accessible food item, though the variety of fish available and the methods of preparation may have varied based on social status. As we continue to explore the flavors of ancient Egypt, let's take a moment to reflect on the role of beverages in their daily life. The most common drink, by far, was beer. But don't envision the crisp, cold beer we know today. Ancient Egyptian beer was a thick, hearty brew, often more porridge-like than drinkable. Made primarily from barley, the beer was rich in nutrients, and it played a vital role in Egyptian society, both as a daily beverage and as part of religious ceremonies. The brewing process was relatively simple. Barley was brewed and fermented into a drink that was slightly alcoholic, but often consumed in large quantities due to its low alcohol content. Historians still debate the exact nature of ancient Egyptian beer. Some suggest it was consumed as a staple, providing essential calories and hydration for laborers, while others argue that its primary purpose was ritualistic, consumed as an offering to the gods or in temple ceremonies. What is clear is that beer was deeply embedded in Egyptian culture. It wasn't just for the common folk either. Beer was consumed by the elite as well, though the quality of the beer might have varied. Wealthier Egyptians may have had access to smoother, more refined brews, while the general population drank a more basic version. Beer wasn't the only alcoholic beverage Egyptians enjoyed. Wine, especially imported from the Levant, was a luxury enjoyed by the wealthier classes. Egyptian wine was usually sweet and often flavored with fruits and spices, including dates and figs. Wine was typically consumed at lavish banquets, where it was enjoyed with rich food and as part of social and religious rituals. The importance of wine in Egyptian society is evident in the tombs of the pharaohs, where bottles of wine were often placed as offerings to ensure the pharaoh's comfort in the afterlife. While wine was a symbol of status and wealth, it was also used in religious ceremonies to honor the gods, especially Osiris, the god of wine, fertility, and agriculture. Historians still argue over the status of wine in Egyptian society. Was it primarily a drink for the elite, or was it a widely consumed beverage? Some scholars point to evidence that suggests wine was enjoyed across different social strata, though in different forms: simple wines for the common people and fine wines for the wealthy. The fact that wine was so frequently included in burial rituals speaks to its importance, not only in the afterlife, but in everyday life as well. As for non-alcoholic beverages, the ancient Egyptians were fond of drinks made from fruits, herbs, and spices. One such drink was hibiscus tea, made from the hibiscus flower, which is still enjoyed in many parts of the world today. Hibiscus tea was often consumed for its refreshing qualities and was thought to have medicinal benefits. It was particularly popular in the warmer months, providing a cooling respite from the heat of the desert. Other herbal teas, such as mint tea, were also consumed, although they weren't as widespread as hibiscus. Another refreshing drink was called sugar water, which was essentially water flavored with dates, figs, or other sweet fruits. This sugary beverage was a treat, enjoyed by the wealthy and sometimes even by the working classes. It's fascinating to consider how Egyptians, without access to refined sugar as we know it, could still create sweet drinks using natural ingredients like fruit and honey. Sweet beverages were often served at feasts, where guests could sip on these sugary concoctions while enjoying the lavish dishes prepared for the occasion. Historians still argue about the availability and consumption of sweet beverages in ancient Egypt. Some suggest that these sugary drinks were primarily reserved for the elite, while others believe that they were a common indulgence available to anyone with access to fruit or honey. Regardless of their accessibility, the fact that these beverages were made from natural sources of sweetness demonstrates how resourceful the ancient Egyptians were in creating flavors that satisfied their palates. One other notable beverage that should be mentioned is the famous sour beer, a fermented drink made from dates. This drink was popular in ancient Egypt, particularly in the southern regions, and was considered a specialty of the Nubian people. It was made by fermenting dates with water, creating a tangy sour drink that was both refreshing and energizing. This sour beer was typically consumed during festivals and special occasions, adding an interesting contrast to the more common, barley-based beer. Its unique flavor profile would have provided a sharp contrast to the more mellow, hearty barley beers consumed by the masses. Sour beer was also thought to have medicinal properties. Some Egyptians believed that the drink could help with digestion and promote good health, which was likely a key reason why it was consumed so frequently at feasts and religious gatherings. As with many other beverages in ancient Egypt, the drink's status wasn't just linked to its taste. It was symbolic of life, renewal, and the cycle of nature. The Egyptians' ability to create a range of refreshing, flavorful drinks demonstrates their sophistication and understanding of fermentation and brewing. Historians still debate whether sour beer was a drink of the lower classes or the elite. The fact that it was consumed in both festival and everyday settings suggests that it was a widely appreciated drink, albeit in different forms depending on one's social status. Like beer and wine, sour beer was more than just a beverage. It was a part of the fabric of Egyptian culture, linking food and drink to social events, religious practices, and the cyclical rhythms of life. Moving on from drinks, we now turn to one of the most iconic foods in ancient Egypt: bread. Bread was the staple of the Egyptian diet, and it was so vital that it was even used as a form of currency. The Egyptians had an extensive range of breads, from simple loaves to intricate honey-infused varieties, and bread making was an art form in itself. The primary ingredient was wheat, though barley was also commonly used, especially in the lower classes. The Egyptians were master bakers, and the variety of bread available would surprise you. Historians still debate the exact methods of bread making used by the Egyptians. Some argue that the Egyptians invented leavening, which allowed their bread to rise and develop a light texture, while others believe they only used simple, flat breads. Either way, bread was baked in a variety of ways. The most common type of bread was a round, flat loaf, which was often baked in clay ovens. These loaves were usually hard and dense, but they could be made softer if they were cooked with a bit of water or fat. Bread was consumed by Egyptians of all classes, though, naturally, the wealthier people had access to finer types of bread. The elite may have enjoyed lighter, airier bread made with finely milled wheat flour, while the common people ate heartier, denser bread made from barley. Bread wasn't just served on its own. It was often used as a utensil, with pieces of bread used to scoop up stews or sauces. Imagine tearing off a piece of bread and using it to pick up a rich, flavorful vegetable stew. It was both practical and tasty, a true testament to the Egyptian skill in making food work for them. Historians still debate whether bread was purely a food for sustenance, or if it had greater symbolic significance. The bread-making process was intricately tied to religious practices, with bread often offered as a gift to the gods in temples. This ritual use of bread could be seen as a way of ensuring divine favor for the crops, the harvest, and the overall prosperity of the nation. It was common to see loaves of bread placed in tombs alongside other offerings to provide for the deceased in the afterlife. In this context, bread became a symbol of both life and death, as it was necessary for sustaining the living and providing for the spiritual needs of the dead. The importance of bread is also reflected in Egyptian literature and art. There are many references to bread in the tombs of pharaohs and wealthy Egyptians, where bread was depicted alongside other luxury foods like meat and wine. The recurring presence of bread in these depictions shows how central it was to the daily life of the ancient Egyptians. Even the simplest bread, a humble round loaf, was worthy of being immortalized in art. This speaks volumes about how bread, in all its forms, was both practical and sacred to the Egyptians. Beyond its symbolic value, bread was a versatile food. It could be made sweet or savory, depending on the occasion. For example, honey was often added to bread to create a sweet, sticky treat that could be eaten during festivals or religious ceremonies. The combination of honey and bread symbolized the sweetness of life, and it was believed to bring good fortune. On the other hand, savory breads were made with herbs and spices, which added flavor and variety to the diet. This ability to create different variations of bread based on what was available or needed showcases the Egyptian culinary ingenuity. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians considered bread to be an everyday food or whether it had more ceremonial importance. Some suggest that bread was consumed so frequently that it became a regular part of daily life, while others believe that it was reserved for special occasions. In either case, bread's role in Egyptian culture can't be overstated. It was a cornerstone of the diet and a symbol of prosperity in life. Let's not forget the role of grains beyond bread making. Grains were used in a variety of ways, from making porridge to being ground into flour for other dishes. Barley, in particular, was a versatile grain used for making beer, bread, and even porridge. The Egyptians were creative with how they utilized grains, ensuring that nothing went to waste. Porridge was often consumed by the lower classes, and it could be made with barley, wheat, or even millet. It was simple but filling, often eaten with vegetables or a side of legumes. Historians still debate the role of porridge in ancient Egypt. Was it a food of necessity for the poor, or was it a common dish across all classes? While it's clear that porridge was a simple and affordable meal, it was also a nourishing one. In fact, porridge was sometimes consumed by priests and other religious figures as part of their daily rituals. This highlights the intersection of food, religion, and social status, where even a simple meal like porridge could carry deeper meaning. Grains, especially barley and wheat, were essential not only for food, but for trade. The ancient Egyptians exported their grain to other regions, including neighboring African kingdoms and the Mediterranean. This trade helped to cement Egypt's role as a powerful, thriving civilization, capable of feeding its people and influencing the wider world. Grain was even used as a form of currency, and the Egyptians established a system of grain storage to ensure that they had enough food during times of famine or drought. So whether it was the humble loaf of bread, the filling porridge, or the valuable grains traded across borders, food was both a practical necessity and a symbol of Egypt's grandeur. And while bread and grains may seem simple by today's standards, they were the foundation of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Now, let's take a deeper dive into the world of meats and fish in ancient Egyptian cuisine. Meat wasn't as widely consumed as grains or vegetables, but when it was eaten, it was often a special occasion, especially for the lower classes. However, for the wealthy, meat was a regular feature of their feasts and banquets, where it showcased the prosperity of the host. The Egyptians ate a variety of meats including beef, lamb, goat, and poultry, but the most common meat was actually fish. Fish were abundant in the Nile River, and Egypt's long history as a nation that thrived along this great river made fish a critical part of the diet. Historians still argue about how often fish was eaten by Egyptians of different classes. Some scholars believe that fish was a staple food, consumed by nearly everyone, while others suggest that it was more of a delicacy, enjoyed mainly by the elite or during religious festivals. The Nile's waters provided various fish species, such as tilapia, catfish, and perch. The fish were often caught fresh and prepared in a variety of ways, including grilling, frying, or even drying for preservation. Fish was usually seasoned with herbs and spices to enhance its flavor, and sometimes it was paired with bread or vegetables to complete the meal. In addition to fresh fish, the Egyptians also had access to preserved fish, which could be salted or dried to be eaten later. Salted fish was often consumed as part of the daily diet, and it was particularly useful for those who lived in the more remote regions of Egypt, far from the hustle and bustle of the Nile Valley. The practice of drying and salting fish was a clever way to preserve food, ensuring that fish could be available even in times of scarcity or drought. Historians still debate the significance of fish in the diet of the ancient Egyptians. Was it a food primarily for the elite, or was it more widely consumed by the common people? Some scholars point to the prevalence of fish in ancient Egyptian tombs and art, suggesting that fish were a symbol of wealth and abundance. Others argue that fish was a vital everyday food for all Egyptians, as the river provided an accessible and reliable source of nutrition. While fish may have been the most common meat, other types of meat were also enjoyed by the Egyptians, albeit less frequently. Beef was a luxury, usually consumed only by the elite, as cattle were a sign of wealth. The Egyptians raised cattle primarily for milk, leather, and as sacrificial offerings in religious ceremonies. But they did eat beef on occasion, particularly at feasts or banquets. The process of slaughtering cattle was highly ritualized, often performed in honor of the gods. Meat from these animals would be roasted or boiled and served with vegetables or bread. Historians still debate how the Egyptians treated cattle. Was their role primarily as a source of labor and milk, or did they play a larger role in the culinary traditions of the elite? Some scholars believe that cattle were primarily kept for their milk and labor, with beef being an occasional luxury. Others suggest that cattle were raised for food as much as for their utility in the fields. Whatever the case, beef, though not a daily food for most, was a prized item in the Egyptian diet and was often included in large feasts. Another common meat in the diet of the wealthy Egyptians was poultry. Chickens, ducks, and geese were often raised for their eggs and meat. These birds were roasted, stewed, or grilled, and they were a regular feature of royal feasts and temple offerings. Ducks, in particular, were highly prized by the elite for their tender meat and the delicate flavor of their eggs. Interestingly, Geese were often seen as symbols of fertility and were associated with the goddess Hathor, who represented love and motherhood. The presence of geese at feasts and banquets could have had symbolic significance, enhancing the celebratory atmosphere of the event. Historians still argue whether poultry was more of a luxury or a common food in ancient Egypt. Some believe that poultry was more widely consumed, particularly in the rural areas, while others suggest that it was primarily reserved for the rich, who could afford the resources to raise large quantities of birds. Regardless of its status, poultry was certainly a versatile and important part of the ancient Egyptian diet. When it came to preparing meats, Egyptians were quite resourceful. Meat could be roasted over an open fire, boiled in stews, or smoked for preservation. It was often cooked with vegetables, such as onions, garlic, and leeks, to add flavor. Meat could also be preserved by salting or drying, much like fish, ensuring that it could be stored and eaten when fresh meat was not readily available. The use of spices and herbs like coriander, cumin, and fenugreek added depth to the flavors of the meat, making these dishes as complex as they were nutritious. Historians still debate the influence of foreign cooking techniques on Egyptian cuisine. With Egypt being a hub for trade and conquest, it's possible that some cooking methods and flavor combinations were borrowed from neighboring cultures. The use of spices and herbs, for example, might have been influenced by the trade routes that brought goods from the Arabian Peninsula, India, and beyond. The Egyptians were not isolated in their culinary practices. They were influenced by the larger world around them, and their food reflects this. As we can see, meat was an essential part of ancient Egyptian cuisine, though its availability and consumption varied greatly depending on social class. While fish was the most common protein, other meats like beef and poultry played an important role in the diet of the wealthy. Regardless of the type of meat, Egyptians were skilled in preparing and preserving it, ensuring that they had access to nourishing food throughout the year. Now, let's shift focus to a crucial part of the ancient Egyptian diet: fruits and vegetables. The Egyptians had access to a variety of plant-based foods, which complemented their bread and meat-based dishes. The hot, dry climate of Egypt, paired with the fertile soil nourished by the annual flooding of the Nile, created an ideal environment for growing a wide range of crops. Agriculture in ancient Egypt was sophisticated, and the Egyptians took great care in cultivating fruits and vegetables that were not only nourishing, but also held symbolic significance in their culture. Historians still debate the extent to which the ancient Egyptians relied on fruits and vegetables in their everyday meals. Some argue that the consumption of plant-based foods was more common in the lower classes, while others believe it was an important part of everyone's diet, regardless of status. It is likely that fruits and vegetables were consumed more regularly by the common people, as they were inexpensive and readily available, while wealthier Egyptians had access to a wider variety of produce thanks to trade. Among the most commonly consumed fruits in ancient Egypt were dates, figs, pomegranates, and grapes. Dates were especially important, as they were not only delicious, but also highly nutritious. Rich in sugars, dates served as a natural sweetener in various dishes, and they were often dried to preserve them for later use. The date palm was so valuable that it was often depicted in Egyptian art, symbolizing fertility and prosperity. Dates were used in a variety of ways, eaten fresh, dried, or made into date wine or syrup, which was a popular drink. Historians still debate whether dates were primarily used as a snack or as an ingredient in larger meals. Some believe that dates were often eaten alone as a dessert or an energy-boosting snack, while others suggest they were used in savory dishes to add sweetness and complexity. Dates were also used in religious rituals and offerings to the gods, signifying their importance not just as food, but as a symbol of the bounty that Egypt's fertile land provided. Figs were another popular fruit in ancient Egypt, and they were grown throughout the country. Figs were eaten both fresh and dried, and they were prized for their sweet, rich flavor. They were often served as part of a meal, either on their own or paired with other fruits. Figs were also believed to have medicinal properties and were used to treat a variety of ailments, from digestive issues to wounds. The fig tree, like the date palm, had symbolic significance, often appearing in tombs and temples as a representation of the fertility of the land. Historians still argue whether figs were primarily a luxury item or a common food in ancient Egypt. Some suggest that figs were a special treat for the wealthy, while others believe that they were widely available and eaten by people of all social classes. Regardless, figs were certainly a staple in the Egyptian diet, and their presence in art and tombs suggests they were highly valued by the ancient Egyptians. Pomegranates, too, were a beloved fruit in ancient Egypt. The fruit's jewel-like seeds were often eaten fresh, and its juice was used in drinks and sauces. Pomegranates were considered symbols of life and regeneration, and were often included in religious offerings and funerary rituals. The Egyptians believed that the pomegranate's many seeds represented fertility and abundance, making it an appropriate gift for the gods and a fitting offering for the deceased in the afterlife. Historians still debate whether pomegranates were seen as an elite luxury or if they were consumed by all Egyptians. Some believe that the fruit's association with fertility made it more of a ceremonial food, while others suggest it was widely available and eaten by the common people as part of their regular diet. The pomegranate's deep red color and sweet, tangy flavor made it a prized fruit, and its significance in Egyptian culture cannot be overstated. Grapes, another staple of the Egyptian diet, were consumed both as fresh fruit and in dried form as raisins. Grapes were used to make wine, which was an important part of both everyday meals and religious rituals. Wine was often served at feasts and offerings, and it played a significant role in Egyptian ceremonial life. The Egyptians were skilled at winemaking, and evidence of their vineyards has been found throughout the country. Wine was enjoyed by the wealthy, but it was also available in more modest forms for the common people. As with other fruits, grapes were not just a source of nourishment. They were also imbued with symbolic meaning, representing joy, celebration, and divine favor. Historians still debate the role of wine in ancient Egyptian society. Was it primarily a drink for the elite, or was it more widely consumed? Some suggest that wine was reserved for the upper classes, while others believe it was enjoyed by people of all social ranks. What is certain is that wine played a vital role in Egyptian life, and the fruits used to make it were highly valued. Beyond fruits, vegetables were equally important in the Egyptian diet. Onions, leeks, garlic, and cucumbers were widely grown and consumed. Onions and garlic in particular were staples in Egyptian cuisine, used not only for their flavor, but also for their medicinal properties. Garlic was believed to have protective qualities, and it was used as both a food and a remedy. Onions were similarly prized for their health benefits, and they were thought to strengthen the body and provide energy. Historians still argue whether garlic and onions were more medicinal or culinary in ancient Egypt. Some believe that they were primarily used for their healing properties, while others suggest they were simply regular ingredients in the Egyptian kitchen. Either way, they were a constant presence in Egyptian meals, and their widespread use in both food and medicine highlights the connection between nourishment and health in ancient Egyptian culture. Other vegetables included lettuce, radishes, and beans, all of which were consumed by the Egyptians in various forms. Lettuce was often used in salads, while radishes were eaten raw or cooked in stews. Beans were a source of protein, especially for the lower classes, and they were often included in vegetarian dishes. These vegetables, though less glamorous than fruits, were an essential part of the Egyptian diet, providing the necessary nutrients to balance the richness of meat and bread. As with fruits, historians still debate the status of vegetables in ancient Egyptian society. Were they everyday foods, or did they hold special significance in religious or cultural practices? Whatever the case, vegetables were vital for a balanced diet, and their variety ensured that the Egyptians had a diverse and nourishing range of foods to choose from. As we move deeper into understanding the foods of ancient Egypt, we encounter one of the most iconic staples of their diet: bread. Bread was not just a simple food. It was the foundation of the ancient Egyptian diet. Nearly every meal, whether for the elite or the commoners, involved some form of bread. It was so vital that bread became synonymous with life itself in ancient Egyptian culture. The Egyptians had many varieties of bread, and it was a common sight in every household, from the humble huts of farmers to the grand banquets of the pharaohs. Historians still argue whether bread was more symbolic or purely functional in the diet of the ancient Egyptians. Some scholars believe that bread, as a staple, represented sustenance and the everyday connection to the land and the gods. Others suggest that bread, being such an essential part of life, was used in religious rituals to honor the gods, particularly as offerings in temples and tombs. It was often depicted in the art of tombs and temples, emphasizing its significance not just as food, but as a symbol of continuity and divine favor. The bread Egyptians ate was primarily made from emmer wheat or barley. Emmer wheat, which is a form of ancient wheat, was more commonly used, although barley also played a major role, especially in the production of beer. Bread was made by mixing flour with water, then kneading the dough and baking it in an oven or on hot stones. The Egyptians were known for their expertise in bread making, and their techniques were sophisticated for the time. Some breads were leavened, creating a lighter, fluffier texture, while others were flatbreads that were more dense and hard. Historians still debate the methods used in bread making, especially when it comes to the use of yeast. Some believe that the Egyptians accidentally discovered fermentation through the natural rising of dough, while others argue that they intentionally used fermentation techniques to create leavened bread. What is clear is that bread was highly versatile. It could be shaped into loaves, baked as flatbreads, or even made into sweetbreads, flavored with honey or dates. Bread was often accompanied by vegetables, cheese, or meat, depending on the occasion. In addition to the bread eaten by the Egyptians, the flour itself was also an essential part of daily life. Flour was used for various purposes beyond just making bread. It was used to make porridge, a dish that was often consumed for breakfast or as a light meal. The Egyptians made a variety of porridges, which were often flavored with milk, honey, or fruits. For the lower classes, porridge was an essential part of their diet, providing a filling and nutritious meal that was relatively inexpensive to prepare. Historians still argue about the role of bread in social stratification. Was it true that the wealthier Egyptians had access to better quality bread, while the lower classes made do with coarser, more basic versions? Some scholars believe that the bread eaten by the elite was finer, made with carefully sifted flour and flavored with herbs and spices. Others suggest that bread, regardless of its quality, was a universal food, and that the differences in bread were more about the wealth of the household, not the class of the eater. Regardless of its quality, bread was a common thread in every meal. But bread was not just a foodstuff. It was also a central part of Egyptian religious practices. Offerings of bread were made to the gods, and bread was frequently depicted in tomb art as part of the burial rituals for the deceased. Egyptians believed that bread, along with other food items, could sustain the deceased in the afterlife. And so loaves of bread were often placed in tombs or on altars as part of the offerings. The quality and quantity of these offerings were thought to reflect the care and respect shown to the deceased, ensuring their well-being in the afterlife. Historians still debate the symbolic significance of bread in the afterlife. Was bread seen as a vital food for spiritual nourishment? Or was its presence in tombs more about the continuation of life on earth? Some scholars believe that bread was seen as a crucial element in ensuring that the soul of the deceased was provided for in the afterlife, while others suggest that its presence in tombs was simply a way of providing comfort to the living by ensuring the deceased's journey into the next world was properly sustained. Interestingly, beer was another essential part of the diet of the ancient Egyptians, and its connection to bread cannot be overstated. Beer and bread shared a symbiotic relationship in Egyptian life. Barley, the grain used to make beer, was often used in the production of bread, and both beer and bread were considered staples of the Egyptian diet. In fact, beer was often consumed alongside bread, particularly at mealtime. The Egyptians had a variety of beers, ranging from a thick, porridge-like drink to a thinner, more refreshing beverage that could be enjoyed during hot days. Beer was enjoyed by everyone, from the pharaoh to the common laborer, and it was a significant part of their culture. Historians still debate whether beer was consumed more for its nutritional value or its social and ceremonial importance. Some believe that beer was primarily consumed as a source of hydration and sustenance, particularly for workers who needed a refreshing, energizing drink while toiling under the hot sun. Others argue that beer played a more ceremonial role, particularly in religious rituals and feasts, where it was offered to the gods as a sign of respect and gratitude. Regardless of its role, beer was deeply intertwined with the culture of bread, creating a rich symbiotic relationship between these two ancient staples. Bread, both as food and as a symbol, played an essential role in shaping the diet and culture of ancient Egypt. It nourished the body, sustained the soul, and was present in both everyday life and in the afterlife. The significance of bread in Egyptian culture cannot be overstated, and its importance can be seen in everything from the granaries that stored the grain to the elaborate rituals that surrounded its preparation and consumption. As we continue our journey through the foodways of ancient Egypt, it's clear that bread, along with the other foods we've discussed, was an integral part of the ancient Egyptian world. It wasn't just a food, it was a way of life, a symbol of sustenance, and a key to understanding the values and traditions of this fascinating civilization. Now that we've delved into the essential foods like bread, let's shift gears and explore the fascinating world of ancient Egyptian beverages. Egypt's hot, dry climate meant that the ancient Egyptians were constantly in need of refreshing drinks to hydrate themselves, and they had a variety of options to choose from. While water was obviously the most fundamental drink, there were other beverages, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic, that played key roles in Egyptian daily life. Historians still argue about the most important beverage of ancient Egypt. Was it the ubiquitous beer, so crucial to both daily life and religious rituals? Or was it wine, which seemed to be reserved for the elite, but was also deeply woven into the culture? Each beverage had its own unique role in society, and in some ways, they complemented each other, fulfilling different needs and desires. Let's first consider beer, a staple in ancient Egyptian life. Beer was the drink of choice for the masses and was consumed by people of all social classes. It wasn't just a casual drink, it was part of every meal. Made from barley and flavored with dates or other fruits, beer had a thick, porridge-like consistency that set it apart from modern beers. It was high in nutrients, providing energy and hydration, which was particularly important for workers who spent long hours in the hot sun, like the laborers who worked on the construction of the pyramids. Historians still debate the exact process of brewing beer in ancient Egypt. Some suggest that beer was made through a simple process of fermenting barley with water, while others believe that it involved more complex methods of filtration and flavoring. What we do know is that the Egyptians drank beer in large quantities. Beer was consumed throughout the day, and it was often drunk from large pitchers or jars. Workers, including those involved in the construction of the pyramids, were often provided with a ration of beer as part of their daily sustenance. Some even believed that the gods themselves drank beer, and it was frequently used in religious ceremonies and offerings. Historians still debate the social significance of beer in ancient Egyptian society. Was it seen as a commoner's drink, or did it have a more elevated status in religious and ceremonial contexts? Some scholars believe that beer was primarily associated with the lower classes, while others suggest that it was a drink for all Egyptians, regardless of their social standing. One thing is clear though. Beer was an integral part of Egyptian life, and it was consumed by everyone. Beer was not the only alcoholic beverage enjoyed in ancient Egypt. Wine, too, played an important role in Egyptian culture, though it is typically reserved for the upper classes. Wine was made from grapes, and the Egyptians were skilled at viticulture, cultivating vineyards in various parts of the country. Wine was enjoyed in a variety of ways, either as a sweet or dry drink, and it was often flavored with herbs or spices. Wine was a symbol of luxury and celebration, and it was consumed during feasts, religious ceremonies, and important social gatherings. Historians still debate whether wine was primarily an elite drink, reserved only for the wealthy and powerful, or whether it was more widely available. Some scholars suggest that wine was a symbol of status and was consumed primarily by royalty and the elite class. Others believe that wine, while still considered a luxury, was accessible to a larger portion of the population, particularly in cities and urban centers where trade was more prevalent. Wine, like beer, was also used in religious rituals. It was poured as an offering to the gods, and it was believed to have divine properties, bringing blessings and favor from the gods. Interestingly, both beer and wine were sometimes used for medicinal purposes in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptian physicians recognized the therapeutic properties of both beverages and often prescribed them for various ailments. Beer, in particular, was believed to have healing properties, especially for digestive issues. Wine, on the other hand, was sometimes used as a sedative or to relieve pain. The medicinal use of these beverages was intertwined with their daily consumption, and it highlights the multifaceted role that both beer and wine played in Egyptian life. Beyond the realm of alcohol, the Egyptians also enjoyed a variety of non-alcoholic beverages. One of the most popular drinks was a sweetened beverage made from dates or honey, which was often served as a refreshing drink on hot days. These sweet drinks were not only delicious, but also nourishing, providing both hydration and energy. Fruit juices, particularly those made from grapes and pomegranates, were also common, especially among the wealthier classes. These juices were often served at feasts or celebrations, where they were enjoyed alongside wine or beer. Historians still argue whether sweetened drinks were seen as a luxury or a common drink in ancient Egypt. Some believe that only the elite had access to sweetened beverages, while others suggest that these drinks were widely enjoyed by people of all social classes. What is certain is that the Egyptians had a rich variety of drinks to choose from, ranging from the simple and nutritious beer to the more decadent wine and fruit juices. These drinks were not just a way to quench thirst. They were an integral part of the Egyptian social fabric, a reflection of their values and a key component of their daily lives. As we explore the drinks of ancient Egypt, we begin to see how important beverages were in shaping the culture and society. Beer and wine represented not just sustenance, but also social status, religious beliefs, and a connection to the divine. The Egyptians didn't simply drink to hydrate. They drank to celebrate life, to honor the gods, and to mark important moments in their lives. These beverages were not just consumed, they were imbued with meaning, creating a rich tapestry of rituals, customs, and traditions. Now, imagine yourself in an ancient Egyptian tavern or at a grand feast in the palace of the pharaoh, surrounded by the sounds of laughter and conversation. The air is thick with the scent of freshly baked bread, the earthy aroma of beer, and the sweet fragrance of fruit juices. You sip your drink, whether it's a hearty mug of beer or a delicate cup of wine, and you feel the warmth of the drink spreading through you. It's not just a beverage. It's part of the shared experience of life in ancient Egypt, a drink that connects you to both the people around you and the gods above. As we continue our journey through ancient Egyptian cuisine, it's time to explore one of the most essential, yet often overlooked components of their daily meals: vegetables. Unlike the luxurious meats and rich stews that graced the tables of the elite, vegetables were the sustenance of the common people. But don't be fooled into thinking these humble plant-based foods were without their own fascinating variety and significance. Vegetables in ancient Egypt weren't just side dishes. They were deeply tied to the religious and social fabric of the society. The Egyptian diet was primarily based on a variety of vegetables, many of which are still staples in Middle Eastern cuisine today. The most common were onions, garlic, leeks, and lettuce. These vegetables were widely grown along the banks of the Nile, taking advantage of the fertile soil and abundant irrigation. But while they were essential to the daily diet, they were also imbued with symbolic meaning, often seen as representations of life, death, and rebirth. Take onions, for example. These bulbous plants were not only a common vegetable in the ancient Egyptian diet, but also a powerful symbol of life and eternity. The layers of the onion were seen as a metaphor for the layers of the afterlife, with each layer representing a different phase of existence. Egyptians believed that the onion had the power to protect against evil and was often used in burial rituals. When placed in tombs, onions were believed to provide nourishment for the deceased in the afterlife and act as a safeguard against dark forces. Historians still debate the exact reasons for the onion's spiritual importance, but it's clear that this humble vegetable held a unique place in ancient Egyptian culture. Garlic, too, was a food of both nourishment and protection. Much like onions, garlic was thought to have magical properties. It was believed to protect against evil spirits, and its pungent odor was considered to have a purifying effect. Garlic was often used in both food and medicine, as it was believed to have healing properties that could ward off illness. Some even believed that eating garlic could provide strength and vitality, making it a favored food for laborers and soldiers. This association with strength and protection didn't stop at everyday meals. Garlic was frequently included in offerings to the gods, used as a kind of divine safeguard. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians saw garlic as a sacred food or whether it was simply a practical ingredient, much like salt. However, it's hard to overlook the sheer volume of garlic found in ancient Egyptian tombs and temples. In fact, it was so highly regarded that garlic and onions were sometimes placed alongside bread and beer as offerings to deities, underscoring their importance in both daily life and religious practices. Another vegetable with deep cultural significance was the lotus flower. While not a food in the traditional sense, the lotus held great symbolic value in ancient Egyptian religion and mythology. The blue lotus in particular was seen as a symbol of creation, rebirth, and the sun. Its connection to the Nile River made it a powerful symbol of the cycle of life, as the flower would open each morning with the sunrise and close with the setting sun. This connection to the sun, God Ra, was so important that the lotus flower was often depicted in temple art and tombs. The lotus flower was sometimes used in cooking, but more often, its seeds were ground into a paste and used as a flavoring for other dishes. It was also a popular ingredient in ancient Egyptian medicine, believed to have properties that could alleviate pain and promote relaxation. In fact, the lotus was so significant that it even found its way into royal diets. Pharaohs would occasionally use the flower in elaborate feasts, or even consume its seeds in symbolic ceremonies to affirm their connection to the divine. Of course, the Nile wasn't just a source of vegetables. It also provided a rich variety of fish, which were a vital protein source for the ancient Egyptians. The river teemed with fish like tilapia, catfish and perch, and fishing was a common occupation, especially for those who lived along the riverbanks. Fish was often salted or dried to preserve it, ensuring a steady supply of protein year-round. But the fish didn't just serve as a food source. They were also tied to Egyptian mythology and religion. One of the most intriguing aspects of Egyptian fish consumption was the way certain fish species were considered sacred. For example, the catfish was associated with the god Hapi, the deity of the Nile's annual flooding, which was crucial for Egypt's agricultural prosperity. The Nile's inundation brought fertile soil that nourished the crops, and in return, the Egyptians honored Hapi by offering him fish, including the sacred catfish. Historians still debate whether this reverence for specific fish species was simply symbolic, or if the Egyptians believed the fish had divine qualities that could bring about blessings and protection. Fish were not only symbolic, they were also a versatile ingredient in the kitchen. It could be grilled, roasted, or prepared in stews, often accompanied by vegetables and spices. This combination of fish and vegetables created a hearty, flavorful dish that was a staple for the ancient Egyptian diet. As you can imagine, the preparation of such meals required a great deal of skill and creativity, as the Egyptians didn't have the convenience of refrigeration or modern kitchen appliances. Aside from vegetables and fish, fruits were also a major part of the ancient Egyptian diet. Dates, figs, pomegranates, and melons were common fruits, with dates being particularly prized for their sweetness and energy-boosting properties. Dates were often consumed as snacks or used in desserts, and they were sometimes made into a type of wine. These fruits were not just eaten fresh. They were often dried or preserved to ensure that Egyptians could enjoy them throughout the year. By now, we've covered a wide range of foods that were integral to ancient Egyptian life, from the symbolic significance of onions and garlic to the reverence for fish and the lotus flower. Food in ancient Egypt was more than just sustenance. It was a reflection of culture, religion, and the deep connection the Egyptians had with the natural world around them. Now that we've seen how food was deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life in ancient Egypt, it's time to wrap up this journey through the grains, vegetables, fish, and symbolic rituals that sustained an entire civilization. From the bread that filled the air with its comforting aroma to the sacred foods that honored gods and ensured a smooth transition to the afterlife, the ancient Egyptian diet tells a story of survival, faith, and connection to the land. Food wasn't just about nutrition in ancient Egypt. It was an integral part of their spiritual life, a means to honor the gods, to ensure fertility, and to pass on cultural traditions. The food pyramid, so to speak, wasn't just about what was placed on the table. It was about what that food represented: abundance, life, death, and the eternal cycle of the Nile. As we've learned, Egyptian cuisine wasn't necessarily what we would call refined, yet it was rich in symbolism and creativity. It was shaped by necessity, religious beliefs, and the resources available to them. Even more fascinating is how these ancient practices still echo in the foods we enjoy today. The onions we add to our stews, the garlic that makes its way into our dishes, the bread we take for granted. These are all remnants of a time long past. In a sense, each bite we take is a link to that ancient past, whether we're aware of it or not. As we reflect on what we've learned tonight, It's easy to see how these small, everyday acts of eating and sharing meals could connect a society to the divine. Perhaps it's the simplest foods, the ones most often overlooked, that carry the most profound meanings. The humble onion, the essential loaf of bread, or the comforting presence of fish in a stew might not seem all that exciting today, but for the ancient Egyptians, these foods were not only sustenance, they were tools for communion with the gods and for ensuring a peaceful journey to the afterlife. So, as we conclude tonight's journey, remember that food is more than just fuel. It's a way of connecting with the past, with traditions, and with something greater than ourselves. As you settle in for sleep, perhaps you'll find yourself reflecting on the ancient Egyptians, on their rituals, their beliefs, and the simple yet profound ways they honored life through food. Now, as we start to slow down, let the imagery of the Nile, the bread, and the offerings to the gods fade gently in the background. The rich history of food in ancient Egypt is just one small part of the vast, complex tapestry that makes up the story of this incredible civilization. But, just like every grain of sand along the Nile, each piece of this story is important. Slow your breathing, close your eyes, and let your mind drift. The wonders of ancient Egypt are still here, in the meals we eat, in the ways we live, and in the quiet, everyday moments that link us all to the past. Sweet dreams.